Good old Yie Ar Kung Fu. Originally a Konami arcade release in 1982, a somewhat different version of the game would later grace the Nintendo family computer roughly a year or so later, and anyone who has frequented the pirate multi-cart scene on the Famicom would note that Yie Ar Kung Fu is one of many Famicom games that would see the rounds in that circuit. So as one could surmise on screen, Yie Ar Kung Fu is a one-on-one fighting game of the pre-Street Fighter variety, where you control the hero, Lee, and must face off against 5 varied opponents in one-on-one combat. Defeat the foe using an array of punches and kicks to proceed to the next fighter, but if you yourself fail, that's okay, you merely lose a life and get to try again, and once you lose all your lives, it's game over, no continues. Every once in a while, you'll play a bonus game killing projectiles for points, and once you defeated Mu, the 5th and final opponent, you'll fight the same dudes again on another, much harder loop, and the cycle continues from there. So your A button punches, your B button kicks, pressing up jumps in which you can perform a jump kick, you can bounce off walls, and not much else. Your attack pool is rather small, so it shouldn't take long to acclimate yourself to the controls, which do work rather well, but what doesn't work quite as well is the collision detection. The idea being that you have to time your blows so that they touch some very precise hitboxes in order to register a hit and deal some damage. That's pretty much the whole crux of Yie Ar Kung Fu, and there's 2 ways you could go about it. Either you see it as a game of timing, as you have to position and time your blows so that they register a hit against your opponent, while also trying to keep from receiving blows yourself, or you see it as sloppy collision detection in which any and every blow that should register a hit doesn't, and becomes a game of chance and you have to throw everything under the sun, hoping you land a couple of hits, while your computer opponent will have no problem returning their favor with relative ease. Really, you could go either way because both are equally valid. The hit detection is particularly picking, and it does require some timed shots in order to move the fight in your favor, which does give it that sense of depth and challenge. However, even with that in mind, there are instances where the collision detection does feel a bit off, and that hurts Yie Ar Kung Fu a touch. And Yie Ar Kung Fu is a very simplistic game at its core, with the barest of bare bones gameplay laid out before you, for a fighting game that is. It doesn't take long to figure out the moves, because they don't require much to execute, as well as the jumping, which is another thing you have to figure out and learn, the way, especially moving forward and back. But once you get a groove and you manage to learn all the quirks of the game, you can have something of a good time with Yie Ar Kung Fu. Sadly, it's a solo endeavor. No 2-player game whatsoever to be found here, which is a bit of a shame. Yie Ar Kung Fu has graphics that are unspectacular even by the standards of the family computer, but good enough to depict everything in a somewhat recognizable fashion. You could recognize Lee as a shirtless kung fu guy. The dojo indeed does look like a dojo in the night sky, and while the game does have a rather unhealthy fetish of throwing big fat dudes for you to beat up, probably because that's the only enemy they could really recycle, at least they look somewhat different enough with various weapons and postures that they hold, and just for a touch of variety, let's toss a lady in there who looks like a lady at least. As for sound, one looping kung fu-esque tune in the background, some light impact sound effects, and a lot of cute little blips replicating hi-yas and all that stuff. It's fine, I guess. Yie Ar Kung Fu is one of the early fighting games, and as such, it's not quite up to the complexity or even the polish of what you typically associate with a fighter these days, especially one from 20 years ago. However, compared to something like Karate Champ or even the first Street Fighter game, Yie Ar Kung Fu is probably the most playable of the bunch, even with its own quirks with the collision detection and jumping. It's not a game you should go out of your way to play to check out, at least not the Famicom version. Maybe the arcade version if you're somewhat curious, but if you get a chance to play this, you could do much worse.